Hello, Endersword here again, this time with a video on the PvP meta ahead of the incursions on April 5th. There's been a few shifts, I think, in the meta, particularly surrounding Phlox, and an increase in the emphasis towards anti-crit chance in the crews. So Phlox obviously has his own anti-crit chance as his officer ability, and there's been a little bit of a shift I've noticed towards more players using the Weyoun crew and Pawn in particular, probably more people acquiring that because of the Section 31 store making it a little bit more available, and we're starting to get a move away from the Carol Freeman stuff, and we're also starting to get slightly longer fights because of the fact that critical chance has been going down, and then there's been some erosion in things like critical hit damage over time as well. So I wanted to discuss a few of the main crew shifts that I'm seeing and options that you have this time around. I feel for the last few months, basically we've had a situation where the Battleship has been in real trouble. The Battleship usually has been running ST Lon, ST Ortegas, and Shax for high-level people, and ST Lon, ST Una, and Shax for lower-level people who have slightly longer fights in them. If you're kind of 50 plus, you're finding that your fights are usually like 1 or 2 rounds long. People that are more in the 30s and 40s do often have longer fights than that, so they're going to have slightly different crews. But I find that one thing you can now switch to, which is going to improve the viability of a battleship, is adding Phlox onto that crew and reducing the critical chance that your opponent is doing. The condition that a battleship was in is that it doesn't produce any crit damage itself, or crit chance itself, sorry. There's nothing that's adding to the crit chance, but there was also nothing that was reducing your opponent's crit chance. So if you were fighting an Interceptor using the Interceptor strike team variants, then you were losing to Garrick because he was basically pushing them to 100% crit. You were doing normal damage. They were doing like 8 times normal damage, so you're going to lose. If you are fighting against the Freeman crew, Honor Guard Worf is going to increase the crit chance by 75% or 100% if he's tier 5, and he's going to blow you away as well. If you're fighting against a Explorer using the Weyoun crew, that's probably when you had your best matchup. It reduces your crits to 0. It basically has no enhanced crit chance itself, and then you're just in a reasonably fair fight. But what this is going to do, by allowing Phlox to go on as an officer, is going to cut into the Interceptor's chance against you and the Freeman crew on any ship's chance against you. So before, basically, if you're running a battleship, you kind of had to run it with a Freeman crew because the Battleship crew just kind of sucked. The benefit, though, to the way that the Battleship strike team is set up is it's the only one of the 3 captains where the officer ability is not what triggers the effect. It's her captain's ability that triggers the effect. So the captain's ability here is when you're on a battleship that has caused burning, then you're going to increase the number of shots you do against your opponent, in this case 75% with this synergy. But her officer ability is going to be the thing that actually triggers the opponent's burning, a 65% chance for 3 rounds per weapon hit at tier 2, higher if that's higher. And because this doesn't rely on synergy, then you don't need both of the officers to be synergistic. Whereas with Ducat or with Weyoun, if both the officers on either side are not either the strike team officer or the isolytic officer, then they don't have a 100% chance of triggering their effect, and then they're going to lose a lot more. But in this case, you can break the synergy and you don't actually lower the chance of creating the burning. So then having Phlox's ability, which is going to be at the start of combat against players, turns out this isn't against just players, it's now players and hostiles, but they haven't changed the wording yet. Phlox reduces the opponent's critical hit chance by 45%. That's at tier 1. I'm really close to tier 2, but he only goes up to 50% at tier 2, but he does max out at 100 at tier 5 for 8 rounds. So the way that Honor Guard Wharf works, he's going to raise it if you've got, like, say, a tier 4, 75% for 8 rounds. So he's going to cut into that a lot and reduce your opponent's crit chance if you're able to get him up. And I don't expect most people to have him at, you know, tier 3, 4, or 5 yet, unless you spend a lot of money. I don't even know if you could. I guess you had to win auctions or something. I don't know if they let you just buy them. But basically, yeah, most people are going to have like maybe a tier 1, tier 2. That 45% is definitely going to cut into the effectiveness of that Honor Guard Wharf. And maybe if you're lower level and their Honor Guard Wharf is lower level, it's enough to completely cancel them out. But at least get your opponent from like 100% to like 30 to 50% chance instead of just critting all the time. So this could start to make the Battleship strike team, or the Battleship PvP crew, I guess in general, just a more viable option, whereas I feel that the battleships have been the worst in PvP combat for at least the past, whatever it's been, 6 or 7 months. Whenever Freeman and those guys started to roll out, this started to become a very weak thing. The option that you have here, depending on your level, you may find more success completely swapping out Shax and putting in ST Una as well. She reduces the shield mitigation that your opponent has, and it does it in a subtractive way. So when it says 30% each round, they start at 80% and you subtract 30% each round. That's with her at tier 3. I think that goes up to 42%. When she is maxed out. So you could completely get rid of their shield mitigation with a maxed Una by round 2. So if you're kind of in a mid-range where your fights are lasting 4 or 5 rounds or so, then you may want to go with an ST Una, because her reducing the shield mitigation to 0 may actually be better than the additional isolytic damage that you'd get from Shax, particularly if you're in a specific matchup like an Augur versus an Enterprise, and you know that their shield's going to keep regenerating over time because of their morale. She may be better to just be like, ignore the Enterprise shields and I'm going to go right through, versus the isolytic, which largely functions by just pummeling their shield down until it's nothing and then doing extra damage to the hull. So you may have to experiment on these, which one is better. But if you are finding that you're getting up against like Freeman crews, then having Phlox there is definitely helpful, as it's going to basically reduce them from just doing crits 100% of the time. And if someone's doing crits 100% of the time and they're even remotely in your level range, then you can't win that fight. So having the ability to do that is definitely super helpful. So we're going to look at our next crew. This one is a variant on the Interceptor strike team. So the normal thing to do here has been to go for the Andy Billups, and then we get full synergy on our Ducat, and we get 100% chance at the hull breach, and then Ducat is going to add more shots per round, and Garrick is going to add more critical chance as each round goes on. So this has been the typical one, and then Andy Billups himself adds on that isolytic damage, 75% when he's at tier 2, in this case when you've got hull breach. However, what's been happening more and more is there's been a shift to every explorer using, instead of the Freeman crew, going with the Weyoun crew when they're going to be fighting an Interceptor. And the Weyoun crew is based largely on pawn existing, which is going to reduce the crit chance you have by 78%. So Garrick is adding 60% per round, but pawn is taking you down by 78% per round. So if you just crash into them in that very first round, you probably have an innate crit chance before Garrick right around 30%. Your ship has a plus 10% chance to it. Your research all added together is about a plus 25. Your opponent can have about a negative 20. This is going to depend on what level you are and what your research is and so on. But for myself, it's about 25 positive to 20 negative on top of what your ship innately does. You're going to then add that Garrick onto it, and you're going to be starting somewhere around an 80 to 90%. Then it's going to knock the 78% of a tier 5 pawn off and reduce you from that 80 to 90 to like 2 to 10% or 2 to 12%, whatever it is, in your specific situation. Then on top of that, if they've got the true crit reduction, it's going to take not much off that, another % or 2. But then in the next round, Pawn's going to trigger again, Garrick's going to trigger again, and you're going to go completely to 0, and there's going to be nothing else. If they also have below deck officers like Kira that reduces another 20%, then right from round 1, you're at 0, and there's nothing you can do about it. Pawn is always going to beat out that Garrick. However, you have an option now, which I haven't seen anyone do yet, and I'm sure someone's thought of this, but I've at least come up with it as a solution to when I need to fight an explorer that is bigger than me, and I still want to be critting in my Interceptor. So if someone is running a Enterprise D with a Wayoon crew, and I'm running a Sanctus with a crit crew, but they can cancel out all my crits, then I'm going to lose that 100% of the time very handily, because they're the stronger ship to begin with, and you're taking away really the only advantage that my crew had. So even though theirs doesn't have much of an advantage in terms of what they get, their ability to cancel out my advantage puts us on even footing. And if we're on even footing and their ship is 3 times bigger than mine, then I'm going to lose that 100% of the time. However, if I get rid of the Andy Billups, if I give up my extra 75% isolytic damage and instead trade it for an extra 75% crit chance that I'm getting out of the gate, now I'm starting the fight instead of with like an 80% crit chance, I'm starting with like 155%. And now when you reduce the 78% off of that from Pawn, now I'm still in the 70s, like 77%, that I'm going to crit against them. So I'm going to crit 3 shots out of 4 against them. I'm trading off the isolytic, which is an extra 75% of my base to them, but I'm going to be gaining instead extra crit damage, which is probably going to be like 500 or 600% instead of that 75%. So if there's ever a case, would you rather do extra isolytic or rather crit? There's almost no case in which I wouldn't rather crit without the isolytic than not crit with isolytic. Particularly too, since hull breach and artifacts and stuff are going to give me some isolytic anyway, as is 7 below decks. Also, isolytic itself has become slightly less strong simply because people's isolytic defense is actually getting better. So as people start to approach 200-300% isolytic defense through artifacts and officers and these below deck people that help out by increasing your isolytic defense, as these improve, then it's starting to be less of a benefit over normal damage, and it's starting to act to something much closer to normal damage. It bypasses mitigation, but it can then be isolytic mitigated, which is approaching the same number over time. The big trade-off to this, however, is, like I mentioned before, if you don't have 2 synergy officers, then all of a sudden the Gul Dukat here is not 100%. Now he only has a 60% chance of triggering the hull breach for 3 rounds. And he'll get that each round. But if I miss in the first round, I've probably lost that fight already, just due to, again, the higher level you are, the more true that is, that the fight will probably only last 1 round, because then you haven't triggered your crit, you haven't triggered your hull breach, you haven't triggered anything that is required to do extra damage, and you're probably going to die. But if he does trigger, then it's going to work out well that you're still going to crit a lot. So it's kind of a way to punch up against interceptors that are usually using an anti-crit crew that would smother you. It gives you at least a fighting chance. If he doesn't trigger, which he won't 40% of the time, then you're going to die a horrible, horrible death. But if you do trigger, then you're at least going to be pumping out the maximum amount of damage you can do against that thing. Whether you actually win or not, depends on how big that difference is. If I'm fighting like a 1.5 billion Enterprise D and a 600,000 Sanctus, I'm probably still going to lose that fight, but I've tested enough to know that I'm doing 2 to 3 times more damage doing it this way than I am trying to do it with Andy Billups and the full synergy. So in a case where you know that that is what the matchup is, and there's someone out there that you're struggling against, and again, I'm giving high-end examples, but it could be a Pilum versus a Corvus, it could be a D4 versus an Enterprise, something like that where you're feeling smothered by them. Having the extra ability to crit is going to make a big difference in your matchup. Even again, like a D4 against like a Valdor, like tiers up, you're going to fight in a more competitive way than you would normally fight if you just tried to go for the normal crew and then their Weyoun crew just smothers you and takes away. It's basically like disarming you, that you're both agreeing to fight with bare hands instead of with guns. And if you're the little guy, you'd much rather use a gun because it's more likely that you're going to get those lucky shots off. So that's kind of the way to go. The other crew, so this is one I was talking about, just to show you how it works, of course. A max tier pawn does 78% reduction to their crit chance for 3 rounds, whereas the Garrick is plus 60% for 3 rounds. And always, no matter what your tier is, the pawn of an equal tier beats the Garrick of an equal tier. So in the long run, the pawn is always going to win in this one. And then you've got Ransom giving you the extra isolytic. The reason that all these crews are starting to beat out Freeman is twofold. One is because, well, threefold actually. One is because the isolytic importance, like I mentioned, is starting to become a little bit less. So it used to be that isolytic was completely going through, almost completely unmitigated, and it was just pure damage. So now that that's a little bit less and you have most people have more defense, that's becoming slightly less important. As that's doing less damage, you're starting to get fights that are a little bit longer again. Also, as you're getting less crit chance, you're going to get fights that are a little bit longer again. So where almost all level 50 plus fights were 1 round and like high 40s fights were 1 or 2 rounds, you're now starting to get fights that are 3-4 rounds long again, because you're not just critting and maxing out all your isolytic now. And I know in the 30s, 40s, you're often getting fights that are still even like 8, 9, 10 rounds long. And that started to elongate again as people are starting to get researches and artifacts and officers that are reducing both the critical and the isolytic. So the longer the fight, the reason that impacts is because Carol Freeman is going to give a one-time bonus of extra shots on your weapons, whereas both Ducat and Weyoun are actually going to give extra shots per round. So Weyoun, instead of giving, Freeman gives 100% straight up, Weyoun is going to give 88% at tier 3 for 2 rounds. So in the next round, it's going to be well above that 100%, almost double it. And Ducat is similar. He's going to give at tier 4 35% per round that he's adding to. So by round 2, he's already at like 210% because he adds it for each of the weapon shots that you get. So basically, both of these guys, the longer the fight is going, the more they're going to eclipse your opponent. Weyoun's actually capped at 2 rounds. Ducat, I believe, is not capped until 5 rounds. So he gets even stronger and stronger the longer the fight goes in terms of the extra shots that you're getting out of him. So that's why we're getting a bit of a shift away from Freeman. The other thing is, of course, the existence of Phlox and the pre-existence of Pawn, but the availability of Pawn increasing with the Section 31 store means a lot of people are now leveling him up a lot easier than they were before, or unlocking him maybe when they didn't have him before because he was hard to get initially. But now he's relatively easy to get if you just do a few waves to unlock whatever it is, 38 shards is not particularly difficult. So a lot of people have him now. So the value of Honor Guard Worf's plus crit is being canceled out by Phlox's negative crit and Pawn's negative crit, which you're starting to see on more and more crews. And then the last thing that makes the Freeman crew in the long run kind of suffer is that it is reliant on Lorca triggering. And Lorca, for most people, probably at a tier 3 or 4, even totally maxed out at a tier 5, is only an 80% chance of triggering the hull breach. And if he does not trigger, then you're completely out of luck and the rest of it doesn't work. You don't get your isolatic damage. You don't get your state on your opponent. You don't get the extra critical damage that he's going to provide to you. And so at tier 4, he's going to miss 1 out of 4 times. Tier 5, he's going to miss 1 out of 5 times. And that's pretty bad when you're fighting in these combats where a lot of the other crews are 100% and they're never going to miss. So you're always kind of taking a chance there against those. The other thing I wanted to talk about, which is kind of a new thing this month, and probably not a lot of people really have them developed yet, and I certainly don't, because I'm waiting until I max out the eye, which is probably the best strategy, is what these new temporal artifacts are going to do. The one I think that caught people's eye quickly is the true critical damage reduction one. And I think because critical damage has dominated the PvP side for quite a while, and because some of the new hostiles have really focused on crit, then I think people's eyes went to this, and it seemed to be the one that the marketing was trying to push, and they were trying to sell packs of this. Obviously, you can see I didn't buy it. So basically, the idea here is once all the critical damage has been calculated, then it's going to take whatever the remaining amount is and take a real 15% off that, not a subtractive 15% like they usually do. So basically, the current situation is at my level 59, if I've got pretty much all my research done and a good queue building and a good Bajoran thing and whatever, my critical damage against a player is probably around 800 to 900%. In terms of when I crit, I'm going to actually be doing 800 or 900% of what the base damage is against the opponent. However, if the opponent has done their research, then they're going to be able to reduce that by about 350%. So if I've got, let's say I'm right in the middle, 850, and they reduce it by 350, I'm doing about 500% extra damage when I crit against them versus when I don't. So if that evens out, then I would take basically the 15% of that value at the end. So basically 75% subtractively. I had a 500% bonus and I reduce that to 425 and take 75% off. Then that's going to be the reduction that it does. This would only happen in cases where I have crit. And as we've seen before, there's a lot of situations now where in a matchup between an explorer and a battleship, nobody's really critting. In an explorer versus an explorer, nobody's critting. Even an interceptor with a normal crew versus an explorer, they're probably going to suppress all your crits. So there's only a few situations now, like interceptor versus interceptor, where now the crit damage is the main driver of who's going to win that fight. Largely, it's still the crit chance and just the actual damage that your ship is doing. So the value of this, while I would say a few months ago, this would be the determining factor, it's becoming less the case because it only applies when someone has crit in the first place. And there are more and more things that prevent that from happening as they add officers and add research. So people's likelihood to crit in matchups make this matter a lot less. The one that I would focus on is ultimately this one, the Cruel Muth B portal. It reduces the damage done of a player by 1200% when it is maxed out. Now, comparatively, you have to then know what is the normal damage bonus that the player is doing. So basically, if you start at the base rate, and you look at all the bonuses that you can get for someone around my level, the bonuses are going to add up to about 6,000%. And then the negatives that you get are probably right around 500%. So say that they're starting off with bonuses of about 5,500%. That's before I'm including, an officer that does that if you got Mariner below deck, but that's only 100 and something percent or whatever. So if I want to look at what's actually going to get me the biggest damage reduction in the most amount of cases, it's going to be this 1200%. If I can take that 55 all the way down to like 4300, that's going to be a bigger difference because it applies in literally all cases against all opponents, versus if I take 15% off the end of only when they crit. Now, if I'm fighting someone that doesn't crit, that doesn't do anything at all. But this one is going to take that 1200% off the top no matter what. So if I'm looking for something that's going to consistently reduce the damage that my opponent is doing no matter what the situation is, then I'm going to be going for this one. And even if other research comes out and some of this, depends on the ship tier and things like that, it's still going to give it to me 100% of the time. While the percentage may be smaller as people are higher up or ships are higher up, it's going to still reduce that by a whole lot. So it's going to be, again, not a true amount, but in terms of the actual percentage that it's saving me, it's going to do it more often, more consistently, and the percentage is ultimately going to be higher than if I went for the other one. Just wanted to talk about these quickly while I'm here anyway, and there's another one that kind of annoyed me as like it's almost a trap for people. There's this one here that increases the base damage versus hostiles by 2000%. It's an epic one, but there is one later on that increases the damage done against wave defense hostiles by 2000%. So if you've got one that does it against everything, every hostile for 2000, and one that does it against only this specific thing for 2000, obviously get the other one first. Even though this one's rare and it would be easier to max out, obviously start working on the other one first before you go to this. Backing up again, the whole, so like I said, this one's probably good for like everyone. This could be useful in PvP, but not as good as the other. The increased hull health one, there's so much hull health bonus in the game that this doesn't really, it doesn't add as much as you'd think it would. It still is kind of a lot if you were to max this out. I think right now there's about, you can get a potential of like 8,000 to 9,000% hull health improvement onto the base through research and artifacts and forbidden tech and stuff like that. So it's definitely substantial, but it's probably not as big as you'd think by that flashy number, 3,000%. It won't, multiply your ship by 30, but it probably will add like 30%, depending on what your level is and research is. And a lot of those things are primes. So if you don't have the primes, which I don't have a lot of, then that would be more useful. So the less of them you have, the more beneficial it is. This one, again, that's my favorite. The repair cost efficiency, good, but it's probably not anyone's top priority. These are the old ones. They were already there. The officer stats one, again, I think this is probably more helpful to people in their 60s. When you really need to be filling out ships with very few ship spots and you need the stats on them, or like the Borg cube, but it's not something I would say to prioritize for anyone until they're done some of the others. The Borg cube is the stupidest thing in the game. This is shit. Increased base damage against wave hostiles, talked about. The syndicate one here is kind of useful if you're a newer player and you've kind of, not necessarily new because it takes a while to unlock these anyway, but if you're like in your low 40s, this one over the course of the next like years that you're playing probably will pay off pretty well. So while it's not going to help you fight anything right now, if you get this up to a point, it's giving you an extra 3,400 Syndicate XP a day when you max this out. That's a lot. Like that will add up over time. You will notice that like 6 months later that you are a lot farther along than you would be otherwise. Warp speed, not convenience. Construction speed saves you some latinum, but it's not super important. And then these crit chance ones are nice, but they're limited to that ship type. But in the long run, these could help for those specific matchups. So if you're on an Explorer versus an Interceptor or whatever, these do not appear to be limited to only hostiles as well. They're also going to work in PvP. So having that extra 15% crit chance eventually is going to be useful. I'm probably going to get one of these, but I don't like that they are locked into the matchup, because like an Interceptor is already critting a lot versus the Battleship anyway. Whether you put Phlox on or not, I'm going to win that one. So that's not the best matchup anyway, but things like, Explorer versus an Interceptor, having that extra 15%, knowing that they don't do anything to reduce yours, now suddenly you've got a 30-40% crit chance against them. That actually could be a really good one. So I think the Explorer versus Interceptor one is probably the most beneficial of those. If you were if you're running an Explorer, obviously that's the most beneficial natural matchup. Anyway, just wanted to touch on those quick, and that's the way I see that the PvP meta has shifted in this past month because of that. So I think you're starting to get Freeman become like the third best or even fourth best crew. You're getting some play with battleships now, whereas they were absolute trash for the last several months. I feel like you could start to use them again, but you're getting a real big matchup mostly between the Explorers and the Interceptors, and that double crit crew is basically a way to try and overcome the anti-crit that the Explorers are doing. Let me know in the comments if there's any other crews that you've been having success with. Of course, I very often talk as if people have access to all these things. I know that a lot of people don't. You know, you may have 2 or 3 officers and you got to kind of improvise with your last spots. You need to use a Gorkon instead of a Lorca. You don't have the isolytic wingman, so you're down to using something else. What have you? You know, discuss some of those if you want any opinions on it, and if you found anything else that's kind of sneaky that seems to work against some of these specific crews, then I'd really like to know it, even if it is a really specific matchup or something like that. Enjoy your incursion and have fun.